"Sir, you don't belong here." Those were the cold words spoken by a flight attendant as a well-dressed black man tried to take his seat in first class. Passengers nearby fell silent. Some glanced awkwardly at one another, unsure of how to react. Others simply stared, their curiosity piqued by the confrontation unfolding before them. The man, in a tailored charcoal gray suit, stood tall and composed. His leather carry-on rested beside him. With practiced calm, he glanced at his boarding pass, then back at the seat. 3A. I'm in the right seat. 3A, he said firmly, holding out the ticket. But the flight attendant wasn't having it. Her tone sharpened, disbelief clinging to her words like static. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. This seat is reserved for our first class. Passengers." "I am a first-class passenger," he said, eyes locked on hers. A beat of silence followed. Then, as if to add weight to her disbelief, she leaned in, voice lowered but no less accusatory. "Is this really your ticket?" The implication hung in the air like smoke. Passengers could feel the tension building. Whispers began to ripple across the cabin. Maybe he snuck up here? Could have been a mistake. Don't they check those tickets at the gate? The man heard it all. Every doubt, every assumption. And yet he didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, because what the flight attendant didn't know, what nobody around him knew, was that this wasn't just an uncomfortable misunderstanding. This was a test. The man calmly reached into his inner coat pocket and retrieved a sleek black leather wallet. From it, he produced a badge and an ID. "Jonathan Banks, Department of Transportation, Office of Civil Rights. I'm a federal undercover auditor," he said, his voice low but firm enough to carry. "This flight has been under observation for potential discriminatory practices. And this, right here, is exactly what we've been investigating." The murmurs turned into gasps. Eyes widened. The flight attendant's face drained of color as she took a half-step back, suddenly unsure of her footing. I didn't mean," she stammered. He raised a hand to stop her. "Save it." By now, a senior flight officer had arrived, alerted by the commotion. Jonathan repeated his title and showed his credentials again. The officer's expression turned grave. Protocol kicked in. Apologies flowed, awkward, hurried, half-formed, as they tried to contain what had already spiraled beyond their control. "I'll be filing a full report," Jonathan continued, "including statements from passengers, crew logs, and security footage, and I'll be speaking directly with your airline's executive compliance team." Passengers who had been whispering only moments ago now watched in stunned silence as the situation flipped entirely. Jonathan took his seat. 3A. The seat he had every right to occupy. The seat that had become a flashpoint of implicit bias, now transformed into a symbol of accountability. The flight resumed boarding. The energy on the plane had changed. Where there had been judgment, now there was introspection. Where there had been silence, now there was a heavy awareness. Some passengers avoided eye contact. A few nodded at him respectfully. One man, seated across the aisle, leaned over. "Thank you," he said quietly. Jonathan gave a small nod. "Just doing my job." But it was more than a job. It was a mission. To test whether the systems designed to serve everyone truly served everyone. To hold those systems accountable when they failed, and they had failed. The report that followed led to internal reviews, sensitivity retraining, and a very public apology from the airline's CEO. It made headlines, sparked debates, and reminded travelers and corporations alike that respect and fairness should not be conditional, and certainly not based on the color of someone's skin. Jonathan had boarded that flight to test a theory. He'd walked away with proof and made sure the world saw it too. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons come not from shouting, but from quiet, deliberate action. From standing your ground when the world tries to move you. From simply taking your seat and refusing to give it up. The man in question was Jerome Richards, calm, composed, and sharply dressed in a tailored navy blue suit with polished Oxfords. At 38, he carried himself with a quiet confidence, the kind that came from experience. On the surface, he looked like just another professional on a business trip, maybe a consultant or executive. But beneath that polished appearance was something far more significant. Jerome worked for a federal agency tasked with investigating racial discrimination in public services and businesses. His job? Travel the country under the radar, embedding himself in everyday scenarios to observe how people of different races were treated. No press, no warning, no cameras. Just a man walking into restaurants, checking into hotels, applying for loans, at banks, and yes, boarding commercial airlines. Jerome's specialty was discretion. He blended in effortlessly, becoming just another face in the crowd. But while others were sipping coffee or scrolling through their phones, Jerome was watching, listening, taking mental notes of interactions, body language, tone of voice, the subtle details that revealed how implicit bias played out in real time. This particular flight was part of a routine audit, one of dozens he had completed over the past year. A simple domestic leg, booked through standard procedures, flagged only internally for monitoring. The agency had received complaints about this airline, nothing overt or explosive, just patterns. Black passengers being second-guessed more often, delayed at check-in, overlooked in premium seating. Jerome had been assigned to find out if there was any truth to it. He'd expected this trip to be like most, uneventful, perhaps a few subtle indicators, maybe a dismissive tone or slower service. But what happened just minutes after he boarded turned this assignment from a quiet investigation into a flashpoint moment. He had barely stepped into the first-class cabin, ticket in hand, when the flight attendant approached him. Her eyes flicked. From his face to his suit, then quickly to his ticket. Her smile was strained, her tone brittle. "Sir, you may be in the wrong cabin. This area is for first-class passengers only." Jerome had heard those exact words before, more than once. But as always, he remained composed. He held out his ticket. "This is my seat, 3A. Her response was instant and telling. "Are you sure this ticket is yours?" In that instant, the atmosphere shifted. The people around him quieted. Heads turned, eyes narrowed or looked away. He could hear the whispers, feel the weight of assumptions pressing in. What she didn't realize, what no one did, was that this wasn't just a mistake. It was the exact kind of moment Jerome had trained for. He studied her calmly. This wasn't about personal offense. This was data, evidence, another tick in a pattern they'd long suspected. But this time, it was too clear, too public to ignore. And Jerome Richards wasn't going to let this one slide quietly. Not this time. Despite showing his boarding pass multiple times, the attendant refused to believe Jerome belonged in first class. She summoned a supervisor. Now 2 airline employees stood over him, their presence more intimidating than helpful. "Sir, please step aside so we can sort out the confusion," one said, voice clipped with forced politeness. Jerome stayed seated, calm but unwavering. "I paid for this seat," he said. "I'm not moving." Tension rippled through the cabin. A few passengers pulled out phones, recording. Some looked away in discomfort. 1 or 2 muttered support, but most stayed silent, unsure, unwilling, or afraid to get involved. Then came the final insult: airport security. 2 officers, boarded, approached slowly, and asked Jerome to come with them, just to verify everything. That's when Jerome decided it was enough. Without raising his voice or showing anger, he reached into his bag and pulled out a black leather wallet. Inside, a federal badge gleamed under the cabin lights. "I'm a federal discrimination auditor," he said, his voice steady. "This interaction has been recorded and will be submitted in full." The cabin froze. The airline staff blanched. The security officers stepped back, their posture shifting instantly. Everything had changed. Once Jerome's identity was revealed, everything changed. The shift was almost comical in its speed. Moments ago, airline staff were hovering over him with suspicion and thinly veiled authority. Now, the same people wore sheepish smiles and nervous expressions. The supervisor offered him a drink. "On the house," she said, as if kindness could rewrite the last 10 minutes. The flight attendant, who had questioned whether his ticket was really his, now spoke in a polite, overly cheerful tone that felt forced and hollow. Jerome offered them a nod, nothing more. No anger, no raised voice, no dramatic confrontation. He didn't need to lash out. The truth, and the badge, had done the talking. He simply sat in his seat, placed his badge and ID neatly back into his bag, and opened his laptop. The glow from the screen lit up his composed expression as he began typing his report, fingers gliding over the keys with methodical precision. Every detail, every word exchanged, every moment of doubt cast on him was documented. This wasn't just another flight anymore. It had become a textbook case of racial discrimination, witnessed by dozens, recorded by at least 3 smartphones, and now part of an official federal report. This flight had started like any other. A seat assignment, a boarding pass, a simple walk to 3A. Jerome had expected it to be routine, but what happened on board turned it into something far more serious and far more revealing. It wasn't the first time Jerome had faced this. He'd experienced similar moments. A hotel receptionist questioning his reservation, a banker doubting his qualifications, a maitre d' offering him a worse table while smiling at the next guest in line. That's why his agency existed, to monitor, track, and expose the silent systems of discrimination that still lingered in modern institutions. But rarely was the proof this obvious, this irrefutable, and this public. By the time the plane landed, whispers had turned into conversations. A young couple stopped Jerome as passengers disembarked, thanking him for standing his ground. Another man, who had stayed silent during the incident, mumbled an apology, not for what he'd done, but for not doing more. Jerome nodded, accepting the comments without judgment. His role wasn't to scold passengers. His role was to hold institutions accountable. Within days, the consequences began to unfold. His agency formally notified the airline that an investigation was underway. Internal documents were requested, crew records, surveillance footage, training manuals. The airline's legal department scrambled to prepare a defense, but the video, the one posted by a passenger sitting in 3B, had already gone viral. The caption read, "Flight attendant tries to remove black man from first class. Turns out he's a federal auditor." The clip spread like wildfire across social media. Within hours, major news outlets had picked it up. Morning shows aired. The footage, political commentators debated the implications, and activists praised Jerome for how he handled the situation. Public response was swift and fierce. Social media lit up with outrage, not just over the incident itself, but over how common stories like Jerome's were, just without the federal badge to make people pay attention. "I've been pulled aside at the gate too many times to count," one man wrote. "My dad got questioned for boarding business class with a platinum card." "This story hit hard," another posted. There was also admiration, for Jerome's poise, his professionalism, and the simple but powerful way he flipped the narrative. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't threaten, he just revealed the truth and let the system unravel itself. Under pressure from public scrutiny, the airline released a carefully worded apology. "We deeply regret the misunderstanding that occurred on Flight 227 from Atlanta to Chicago," it read. "We are committed to creating an inclusive and respectful travel experience for all passengers and are reviewing our training and protocols to ensure this does not happen again." But for many, it wasn't enough. Activist groups called for more than just apologies. They demanded reform, tangible, transparent change in how airlines trained their staff, how complaints were handled, and how racial profiling was prevented. Jerome's agency received a surge in reports from passengers, sharing similar stories. Some hadn't reported their experiences before, thinking they'd never be believed. But now they saw someone who had stood up and been listened to. As for Jerome, he remained largely out of the public eye. He didn't give interviews. He didn't release a statement. He kept working, flying, observing, recording, because that's what he did. He wasn't in it for fame. He was in it for change. That flight became part of a larger pattern in his reports, a moment that highlighted how bias can surface not in grand gestures, but in subtle, everyday ways, in a question, a refusal to believe someone belongs, and how powerful it can be when someone refuses to accept it. Jerome Richards wasn't trying to make headlines, but sometimes doing the right thing, quietly, calmly, and with conviction, is all it takes to spark a national conversation. And he'd be back on another plane the next week, ticket in hand, ready to keep the system honest. Because for Jerome, justice flew first class, and it always had a seat. This story isn't just about Jerome. It's about how people still judge others based on skin color, even in 2025. It's about how power, when held quietly and used wisely, can change systems, not just embarrass individuals. Jerome didn't yell. He didn't insult. He let the truth speak for itself. And in doing so, he reminded the world that racism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the assumptions, the questions, the side glances. His story reminds us that you never know who someone is, and that everyone deserves respect, regardless of appearance. The airline later issued a public apology. The flight attendant was reportedly suspended, and Jerome, he kept flying, kept observing, kept fighting the quiet battles most people never see, because that's what real change looks like. If this story inspired you or opened your eyes, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, real-life stories that matter.